It's going live.
All right.
Ooh, gotta love the recording announcement there. That's part of what makes for good audio, but we can always cut that out in the finished version. Hello and welcome to the Cardboard Herald's Off the Table, a resurrected show that is all about gaming news and topical discussions and questions and just friends hanging out. I'm joined by co-host John Foster. How's it going, John? What's new in the world of board games?
I don't think there's anything new in the world of board games in this room, but it's awfully hot up here, Juno.
Yeah, well, I've been seeing on the Discord, you've been playing a lot of Marvel Champions, and you got some Marvel Champions in the back room there. You've been playing solo with other people. What's going on in the Champions table?
Getting it out. Well, I just got the Drax pack in. The Drax pack. Sounds awfully sharp there. I gotta say it again.
Sounds destructive.
But I'm current on all my heroes, so I had to break them out. I got the wife to play one round, but then I soloed the rest of the new ones. And let me just say, Zola stomps face. Changed my mind.
Were you doing Drax versus Zola? I'd be interested to see how you do the canonical gymnastics in order to make that lineup happen. I mean, Marvel's done crazier things for sure, but still, that those don't seem like paired villains to me, or villain and anti-hero.
I don't think about it that carefully because I'm not that familiar. I mean, I'm more of a DC guy when I was a kid. So if you ask me about Green Lantern, I know a lot more about that. But robot facing chess guy, I don't know. He's just a cool new villain for me to fight.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, our main topic today is purging games, and we're going to get that out. We're going to start sharing our own knowledge, our history, our experience, our recent experience of purging games. But I do want to first kind of hit a couple news items that have come up recently. Some of them are more directly linked to you than others. The first one is I kind of wanted to get your read on this Terraforming Mars Ares expedition controversy. There's a lot of pitchforks. There's a lot of torches. There's a lot of people upset by apparently the new hotness, the Terraforming Mars game, the mini condensed Terraforming Mars game, being picked up by Target with an exclusive retail edition that is stocked in Target as we speak before the backers actually get copies of the game. Now, you're a backer on this project, right?
I am, yeah.
Yeah. How did you feel about this?
I'm going to be honest. Probably the unpopular non-pitchfork opinion is that I don't care that much. But I thought about that opinion. That was my initial knee-jerk reaction, and I thought about that opinion because a lot of that comes from, one, I don't have a Target in my town. That helps.
Yeah.
So there was no
true.
faster way to get it. But I think, too, it came down to an internal assumption that this company, maybe they had to, maybe they had to do the Kickstarter to help get funds to get that first print run. Maybe, there was some reason why it occurred. It was all kind of a good faith assumption that, Stronghold Games wasn't trying to be shady about it. And I thought about that, and maybe that's true, but maybe that's also kind of the consumer in me wanting to conflate my love of board games for the company itself. I mean, it's true.
Right.
Do that a lot with video game communities where you assume that the company is acting in your best interest just because you love the product, and that's not always true. So maybe I need to hold them to a higher standard. What do you got on it?
Yeah, I don't know. To me, this is a lot of surprise Pikachu on both parties' parts here. Because to me, the original assumption of Kickstarter is that this game would not get made without the backers. And so above all else, you should be loyal to your backers. You want to make sure that they feel validated and they're the priority. Without them, the game wasn't going to get made. And so they're the people who really should get the game first. And Stronghold is no spring chicken when it comes to just the board game industry in general, and particularly Kickstarter. They've done Kickstarters in the past, and they kind of knew, I gotta imagine that they knew going into this that people are going to be pissed off that backers want to get the first copies of this. And anytime retail outlets get copies of games before backers get them, that's just a recipe for disaster. The other thing about this is that, I don't know, I think there's a lack of transparency on the part of what's going on here for Stronghold. I mean, don't get me wrong, I want more games to reach more gamers, and I think that's going to be a good thing ultimately, regardless of what you do. And so I have no problem with the Target exclusive as imagined. But I don't know, like I don't think this had to be announced in the 11th hour where it was like, oh, by the way, tomorrow people are going to be able to go out and buy the game that you've been waiting patiently for
You're
months.
still waiting for a tracking number.
Exactly. So, Jeffrey and Deborah, who are just like perusing Target for, they needed to go there to get a duvet. And they're like, oh, Deborah, let's go over to the board game section. I'm sure they have Monopoly. And then they just happen to see this Terraforming Mars Ares Expedition game. They're like, oh, look at this, Jeffrey, we can get this. They bring it home, they're playing it, they're enjoying it. Whereas you, the person who put your good faith and your money towards making sure that this comes out, you had to wait a couple more months in order to get it. On the other hand, I think everyone who backs something on Kickstarter now in the year of our Lord 2021, or I guess it was 2020 when people were backing, have to know that, like, for the most part, this is a money-making scheme. I mean, this is a pre-order service, and companies are going to do what is best for their bottom line. And Stronghold is doing exactly that. So I don't think this necessarily comes as a surprise. It's a disappointment for me, but it's not necessarily a surprise. And the end result is going to be more access to what looks to be a really cool game. And I'm personally not a backer, so it doesn't affect me that much. It would affect me greater, but maybe in a more positive light if we had that Target in our neighborhood. You know what I mean?
Right. Well, and let me just offer that maybe split the difference. Maybe let's assume some good faith here. I'd like to think that they're maybe acting in their own best interest, but of course they don't want bad publicity. So I'm assuming that this is a kind of a gotcha moment for them, where they thought they could get the backers their copy and get Target handled, and due to the differences in manufacturing or whatever, that this caught them by surprise, and hopefully they learned their lesson, because it really doesn't generate a lot of goodwill, even from someone like me, where I'm relatively indifferent because I am experienced. I have way too many Kickstarters under my belt to expect it to be anything other than a pre-order service for most established companies.
And besides, for the Kickstarter backers, they needed to get you the exclusive sleeves for all of the money tokens that are going to be delivered to you, right? They got to make sure everyone is individually Ziploc baggied.
I would say back it for that, but I think that the exclusive individual sleeving was for the big box only. I think you missed out if you didn't back that.
Oh, okay. So that's like top tier backers. That's who they're loyal to. Everyone else is just schlubs. They needed to please the people who are into the big box proper Terraforming Mars.
Come wrapped, in one bag, I'm sure.
Vacuum sealed, like ready to be put into a pharaoh's tomb to be, carried into the afterlife. That's the plan there.
For anybody who doesn't know what we're laughing about here, if you haven't backed the Terraforming Mars big box, there was a bit of a production oops where every single one of something like 120 metal cubes, if you ordered the premium metal cubes for the resources, every single one came in its own Ziploc bag within another Ziploc bag within another Ziploc bag.
It was Ziploc-ception.
Yeah, I mean, it was one cube in a mini bag, that color of cube, all the copper ones in a bigger bag, and all three of the colors in one bigger bag. So it was 3 layers of bagging, and it took me probably an hour to debag those.
All right, I got 2 game announcements that I want to bounce off of you really quick first before we move on to our main topic. First one, we have a new Gale Force 9 Dune game, which Gale Force 9 was the company that resurrected, just like I was talking, we resurrected. This is a like Lazarus-ian podcast here. We're talking about a lot of resurrection going on here. The Good News podcast. Uh, Gale Force 9 brought back the original Avalon Hill Dune game, and for better or worse, it is that old school game. It is definitely touched up around the edges to modernize it just a little, but for the most part, it maintains that old school flavor when it comes to the design and, you know, the expectations of what you're getting into. We got this new one that is meant to be the same system overall, but better tuned for a 2 to 4 player experience, and has visuals that are bringing you that sweet like Timothy Chalamet picture, that Oscar Isaac visage. So you can have the actors from the new upcoming Dune movie on your tabletop. I don't know what's your vibe on this. I know you're a big Dune fan like me. You like area control games, but does this have you tantalized, or are you feeling kind of cool on this announcement?
Hot take: if it doesn't have Captain Picard wielding a pug into battle, it's not going to be good enough.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even know how Josh Brolin can compete with the man himself, Picard. Patrick Stewart as Gurney Halleck. It's just going to be disappointment abound if there's no pugs toted.
Yeah, no. The big thing, I'm really interested to see how it pans out. I do have kind of a glut of this type of game, the area control, you know, head-to-head conquest type game. But Dune is kind of a favorite old-time game of mine, and I gotta say, if it can pull off the 2 to 4 player experience, it's a much better player count. But it's going to have to do that and still capture all of the sort of backstabbing, dynamic deal-making, trading aspect that you're kind of expecting from this. It's got to feel like you're part of a faction with, you know, interconnected alliances. And I don't know how well it's going to do that with 2 to 4 players. I mean, that's a challenge. That's what 6 players really does well, I think. So.
For sure. Though I think there's so many iterations that have happened in like the last 2 years in particular when it comes to area control that have kind of conceptually approached how do we make like this bigger experience into like a 2-player game. I think actually a lot of solo play development has had designers thinking outside of the box in how to simulate larger scale experiences even at lower multiplayer player counts. Eric Gall here. Yeah. Eric Gall in chat is mentioning that he loves Gale Force 9 Dune. And I agree. I think the GF9 Dune is such a beautiful package. I love the cartoony art aesthetic. And I think that's going to be a challenge for this new one, because not since, I'd say, Battlestar Galactica, speaking of games that have come up a lot in discussion recently, not since BSG have we had a licensed game with like stills or very, very closely tied to a movie imagery in this level that is going to be confronting the tastes of the modern gamer. I mean, I guess Dune Imperium is at least artistically rendered to represent all the actors from the movie. You know, it's clearly Khal Drogo as
which is cool,
Duncan Idaho.
He seems like a cool guy, so he, you know, that's kind of cool to see him in a board game. It's like, oh, look, it's Aquaman.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
But I got the impression that the new game, now correct me if I'm wrong, is it real stills, or is it more that artistic take on it, just like the Imperium was? I got the impression.
Yeah, I'm getting that impression that it's going to be the artistic take. And even looking at the board itself, it looks like there is more of an abstraction of Dune. Like, it doesn't even seem to have a lot of stills or even characters on the cards themselves, or if it's, you know, characters that are like nondescript characters, like here's your Sardaukars, or, you know, whatever Harkonnen, you know, legions that are coming in here, and not specifically the actors. But it does seem to be almost like one of those old, I wish I knew the artist, but think of old like Steven Spielberg or even like Star Wars painted posters, where it is like very highly detailed to look like the actors.
Oh
And
yeah.
I don't think I necessarily got that vibe from Dune Imperium, but this new Dune game, if it's not stills from the movie that are in it, it is much more richly detailed in order to evoke that movie tie-in. They're like, yo, this movie is coming out and we want to capitalize on it.
Can,
But if it's a
can I
good
just
game, it's
make
a good game.
Yeah, but can I just make one point too, as a nerd who will never be a famous actor, much less a famous actor acting in a movie that then gets made into a board game. That would be the ultimate two-tier dream of nerdy stardom, is to both be in the Dune movie and then get to be featured in the art for a Dune board game.
Tell you,
You see those the celebrities where they frame their movie poster or their platinum selling album. I would definitely have my board game box framed with my face on it.
now, would you be willing to be like the CGI model, with all the green screen baubles and bulbs all over yourself, the Andy Serkis to the Gollum of Dune by being the pug that is being carried into battle by Josh Brolin?
Only if I get a special promo card.
Okay, I'll definitely make sure. I'll put that in the request order that I send over to GF9. Be like, you need to make sure this happens. Other announcement. This one's more exciting for me because I'm the leader fanboy of the two of us. But I was delighted to see that there's an announcement for Fort, the little deck building game, kind of like a consolidated, cute little deck building game that is a reimplementation of an older deck building game that Leader put out recently. It is a cats and dogs expansion, just a little card deck. But Leader Games is huge. People love them. And I want to know, John, if you were trying to get like a mascot for a fort that you were building with your friends as a kid, would it fall down to cats or dogs? Would you do mascot of like your local neighborhood cat or your local neighborhood dog?
Unquestionably dogs.
Okay. Yeah, it makes sense. Though cats, I think, are rising in popularity with the internet. I'd be interested to see what someone would say these days, because like the internet wasn't a thing when us old fogies were little kids building forts in the wilderness. So I wonder if cats, their stock has risen. Oh, there we go. Steve Manser, Drew Struzan. So Steve Manser in chat just saved us by saying that Drew Struzan is the artist in the mega movie posters. Thank you for saving me there and making sure that we're giving credit where credit is due. If you don't know what I'm talking about, then look up Drew Struzan. These are like some of the most iconic movie posters of all time, in which like every pockmark on Mark Hamill's face is lovingly rendered in the Return of the Jedi poster or something like that. But we're here to discuss something, John. We're here to discuss Purging games. Both you and I have looked at our collections many times throughout our gaming lives, which has been decade spanning at this point, and gone, man, we need to cut some games. And so we thought we'd make that kind of the main discussion point for this episode before we get into some audience questions. If people want to post anything in chat, they're welcome to. I know over on our Discord, we got a question specifically about Purging games. But John, like, why is this an interesting discussion topic to you? Like, why is it worthwhile to talk about?
I think it's one of those things that when you first start in board gaming, as more than just a hey, I happen to own this one Cards Against Humanity game or something for when friends come over. When you first start actually getting real hobby tabletop games, and you're up to like 10 or 12 or so, an average person might look at that and say, look, my game shelf, like I have a little shelf for some games, and that's great. But once you reach that point, you start becoming a true hobby gamer, and you're looking at board game journalism, you're seeing what's coming out, you're seeing what's new on Kickstarter. It starts to become real easy to get the new hotness, get that fear of missing out, get that, well, there's a hole in my collection. What about this player count? What about this type of game that I don't have something for? And there's also that very much that excitement that you get when you play a new game for the first time and it does something slightly different than those other games did.
Right, right,
And
right.
so it's really easy to get collection bloat where you just pile up, and it's not like getting a book on your Kindle or get listen to a new song on Spotify. These things take up shelf space, and
Yeah,
they are permanent.
the way I think about it is that when I first started collecting games, I felt like I had to own every game that was fun. Like
Yep.
I think that was the biggest problem, is that like every game that I enjoyed, I wanted to have it. And I think part of it is because like you're so myopic when you start. You don't have an awareness of how truly large the world of great games are, because you're so used to playing like, okay, maybe I played Magic or Yu-Gi-Oh or Pokemon or whatever, and then growing up you might have played Risk, or maybe you played Catan or Carcassonne with some people, and then you start going to a game night and you go like, oh my god, this like completely changes everything. This is so different than all the other games that are out there. And you feel like surely there can't be more than 10 amazing games. And so you buy all 10 of those amazing games, and then you find out that there's 50 amazing games, and you buy all 50 of those amazing games. And lo and behold, it, there's thousands of amazing games out there. And if you want to buy them all, it's going to be a problem, whether it's on your budget or on your shelf space.
Right. Or honestly, on the squishier side of things, even on just your own mental well-being too.
Oh yeah, of course. Totally. Totally.
It gets to a point where it becomes a very Marie Kondo situation where you start to look at that shelf of shame. You
Yeah.
start looking at your games and going, man, I feel kind of bad that I own these things that just aren't getting played. And I think you
Mhm.
described it really well by saying, it comes down to, you don't realize that you play a good game, you don't have to own it. But every time you do play a good game, if you enjoyed it, you can see yourself, you can envision yourself playing it again.
Right.
It's somehow you don't ever sit down and you don't ever do the calculus that is required to figure out, well, my free time actually doesn't add up to a collection of 200 board games, so maybe I shouldn't own that many. Maybe I only have room in my life for 20, 50, 70, whatever the magic number is for someone.
Okay, so you build up, you build, you take it all in, you put it on your shelves, so what's the purpose of getting rid of the games? Like, what for you, when you've made several purges at this point of games in your collection, what was the intent? Making room for more, relaxing the mental state, making some cash? Like, was there any one true motivation that superseded the others?
I think the overarching reason for me was the mental state. To be honest, it weighed heavily on me, and to me, my hobby is reflective of where I'm at in life. To a certain point,
Mhm.
there was a time in my life where I was a young adult and I was playing games like Magic, and I sunk a lot of my disposable income into pursuing those hobbies, and a lot of my time into pursuing those hobbies. And it was easy to do because my time was my own, and I could do anything I wanted with it. And then I moved on to being kind of more, but I didn't have a ton of money, so it was like I could only have one of those things. I could play Magic, and I didn't really explore other games. But then I get up to Alaska, I meet some friends, some cool people, I get a decent job, and I've got a little more disposable income, and all of a sudden the whole world of hobby gaming opens up even wider. And this is maybe 10, 11 years ago now. And for a good 4 or 5 years, it felt like sky's the limit, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
And then about 5 years ago, I meet my wife. I end up, with a family, and my life has changed again. And I'm looking at this shelf of things that I collected in that time period where I had extra income. And I had more than enough time to seek out new players, new circles of friends. If I had a group of friends who didn't like a certain game, I could get it played somewhere else. I
Right.
all the time in the world, right? And now I have to look at my time and I have to say, what can I do to optimize the fun I'm having with the amount of time I have? And when I look at my shelf and I see games that I just know are never going to make that cut, it brings me down to see things that I love that they're just never going to get played.
Yeah, it's like a specter that looms over you and is like a reminder of your life changing in a lot of ways. Or in my case, like I'm a super sentimental person, and like I like my toys, I like my games, they're on my shelf, and I want to get them played. And this is such a weird a sunken cost fallacy thing, but I think if I have a game on my shelf, it needs to get played. It deserves to get played. And so even though I'm like, oh, I really want to play game X, like right now I was thinking the other night about like, oh, I really want to get to the next chapter in Adventure Tactics. That's a actual example. But then I was like, oh, but it's been so long since I've played Duelosaur Island. I should probably play that. And there was almost like no joy that came out of the fact that I was going to play Duelosaur Island, which is a good game and still on my shelf, which I really want to play. But there's a cost to all of these games being on my shelf, kind of fighting for my attention. And, that love that just oozes for gaming is being spread thin over all of these. Whereas if I have more of the games that I truly love that I'm going to get to the table, I can dive into them deeper and get those rich experiences that I really want. I like variety, but I also don't like the baggage that necessarily comes with the desire to play all of the games on the shelf.
Right. And what's an interesting thing is you think about that sunk cost idea. And if you imagine going to the movies with a group of 3 to 4 people, it's going to run you 40, $50, and maybe more if you're buying snacks, right? So
yeah.
And if we're going to the movies, I'm buying snacks. So you think that's at least one board game's worth of entertainment, and that's a one night, maybe 2.5 hour experience for 4 people. Well, I could do that with a single board game, but then that board game sits on my shelf, and it could be a better value. I could get that game played more than once, right?
Yep.
So that sounds like I'm selling board games as this great cost effective way to entertain people, but also we don't mourn the fact that I'm not going to ever watch that movie again after I've watched it. I don't watch it sit and collect dust on my shelf. So if there's not room to get it played, it's not adding value by possessing it.
Totally.
If you can play something once and say, well, that was a neat game, but do I need to own it? You might be in a better place. And that's where Purging comes into it, where I look at those games, and like you said, I look at the games that I'm playing and I ask myself, am I just checking a box to say I've gotten it played at least once this year? And did I really want to play that? Or was I really more interested in playing something else?
Now, do you kind of like future proof yourself? I mean, we're talking about these squishy things, which are great, actual things that we have to contend with. But there's a real practical end of it for me. Being a board game reviewer, I get a lot of board games sent to me for review. And at a certain point, even games that I really enjoy, I have to get rid of in order to make room for the games that I love most. I have a unique perspective on this, I guess, compared to many gamers, though there certainly are a lot of gamers out there who probably get just as many, if not more games than me and don't review games. But I try to account for not just the games that I have on my shelf right now, but I need to make sure that I'm constantly ejecting games in order to be able to contend with the things that are coming down the road. I want to feel good about a new game coming into my house instead of being like, oh, this is a problem.
I think I play it more on like a debt system where I'm always catching up to the purge rather than purging ahead of time. And that comes down to the question, when do you initiate a purge, right? Like what's the triggering moment? And I think rolling back to the squishy thing for a moment, I think if you're having any of those feelings where, you ever find yourself feeling bad about something that hasn't gotten played, that's definitely a time to do it. Other indicators might be things like a little bit more hard and quantitative, like if you look at your shelf, has a game gotten played within the last year or 6 months or 2 years, whatever your metric is that works for your cycle of games. And I think that kind of comes down to what best fits your system. And for me, my system isn't based on when I play the games. I have a set number, and it's a 1 in, 1 out. But I let myself, I kind of have a little wiggle room with that. Like if I get a new,
you gotta
game
have the
here
wiggle
there,
room. I mean, it would be a nightmare if you were too hardcore about it.
It would be. I'm not gonna instantly go out and purge a game as soon as I buy a new game. But when I'm at like 4 or 5 over, then it's time to prune a few.
Mm-hmm.
And and every time, and I'll be honest, knowing that that's coming, I prepare myself whenever I'm considering a game. It puts me in a better mindset as a consumer. Maybe not to be as wasteful about how I purchase my games, and it's really slowed down how much I buy because I look at it and go, I know that in say 6 months I'll be 5 over my limit or so, and it'll be time to purge, and what's going to get sacrificed, and if I buy this new game, Is the new game getting sacrificed? Well, obviously not, right? So then what is it replacing?
I don't know. There's been some new games, including games that I bought, that have gotten to my table, and I've been like, "Oh, this is not what I really wanted to sign up for." So it
Well,
might get the purge in
that's
some
the hope, though.
instances.
When I'm buying
Yeah,
something new, is because I'm hoping that it will be an improvement on the collection, right? The idea is
totally.
that the collection is moving forward in terms of I'm always getting the best experience possible. So hopefully it's getting better. You're right, though. I have purged a few games where I'm like, I think I regret buying that because I know
Hmm.
it's going to go to the purge pile real quickly. Hope someone else loves it.
Right, right. Well, I know that there's all kinds of metrics that you can use. You mentioned probably some of the best and most solid ones earlier, having a hard limit or looking to see, have I played this game within the last year? Um, you could also just use a very visceral element here by just looking at your shelf and seeing which of them have literally collected dust. That happens to me sometimes. I'm like, oh, my Cyclades copy back here. I had to go in and dust that sucker. And at that point, it's like, well, as attached to the game that I am, maybe that's a good sign that I should take
Oh
some
man,
action.
did you purge Cyclades?
Not yet. That's on
Oh,
the
okay.
pending purge list here right now. A lot of games in that vein have been purged. Comet got the chop from me shortly before, oddly enough, the new one was announced, and that actually put a kind of wrench in the resale of the original edition, because I think people were like, Comet needs a new edition. They weren't
What's
hot for the first.
funny about that is I purged BSG and it sold on eBay just 2 days before or after Atlantica, Battlestar Atlantica came out as an
Yeah, yeah.
announced thing, which is crazy because there's obviously some people out there. It sold pretty well, and I'm just going to say that there's obviously some people who were like, if it doesn't have Edward James Olmos on it, I don't want
Yeah, speaking
it.
of
Who
pockmarks,
really wanted the OG?
you gotta have the EJO. I mean, who else is going to think about the kids? Plus, I mean, BSG is one of those franchises that people are nuts for. Not only was it an iconic game that completely like shaped a genre. I know it didn't invent the hidden trader mechanic, but it certainly kind of introduced it to a wider audience and defined.
Popularized it, maybe,
Yeah, yeah, popularized it.
or helped.
Yeah, assisted. It was there kind of saying, this is how this should be from now on. Like white kids in Britain didn't invent rock and roll, but they did kind of shape it into this new thing that was like pop rock for the next 40 years, so to speak. But BSG is like, people are fanatical about the series as is. So if you have a good game and something that people know now will never get a new edition in the way that it was, then they're probably going to go crazy for it. Buy up all the copies. Plus the expansions for that game, I think were super hard to find, and people were probably kind of concerned that that wouldn't be introduced into that new FFG thing.
Right.
But as far as purging, okay, so we got the when are we going to purge, the checking the dust, checking the list, those kind of things. We got some of the reasons to purge. So like, let's talk about methodology. Like, for me, I would say at this point, on an every other month basis, I'm looking at my shelf and going like, what could get trimmed here? My shelves are getting a little too full. The vacant slots that I made in my most recent purge have now been filled up, and I need to start thinking about this again. I don't necessarily dump all my games every other month, but I would say at least every 6 months, I'm starting to look at like, let's make this happen. Let's cut some games here. And I try to think about the games that I haven't played in the longest. And I try to imagine myself getting them to the table again. And like, what does that do for me? Does that actually inspire something in me? Do I imagine that I'm actually going to get it onto the table again? Or am I holding on to it because I love the memories of playing those games? Imperial Assault is a great example of that for me, that I have such good memories of playing that campaign. But the reality of playing it again, I'm kind of holding on to the idea that I might do the fully cooperative stuff now. But I don't know. That's a huge chunk of space on my shelf.
I think that's an interesting thing to bring up is what is your system for looking at it? And I'd like to think that your system is that bench that I see sitting next to your shelves. So once the pile gets about 4 or 5 deep on that, then it
Yeah,
starts to
yeah,
be like it's time for a purge, right?
yeah,
Um,
exactly.
but I think you and I have a similar method in terms of what we do is that we purge and we usually shuffle them off to another room in the house. And once we get enough, we'll usually deal with them at that point because dealing with them is its own question. But for me, when it comes to actually what do I pick to do the chopping block, um, I have a spreadsheet. I'm kind of a spreadsheet nerd, which I do a lot for my job. So of course I built a spreadsheet for my board games. I have a spreadsheet of my game inventory of what I own, and I honestly, when I look at that and I realize, okay, I'm about 4 or 5 games over, I go through just kind of mentally and I think about categories of games, like what types of games do I own and what niches do they fill? What are we engaging in? And it's not just these really pedantic board game types. Like we were talking about campaigns. What defines a campaign? I don't think
Mhm.
about it in terms of very pedantic terminology. I think about it as what activity are we engaging in?
Sure.
Is it social deduction type bluffing? Are we engaging with the other players? Is it direct conflict? Those kinds of things. Is it very economic and very mathy? And I think about those broad sections, and each one might have 10, 15, 20 games in it in my collection. And I think to myself, well, okay, if I go down that roster of 10 or 15 games, what are like the top five? Okay, those are safe. And then what are the middle five? Okay, those are safe. And then what are the bottom five? Those maybe one or two or three of those could go. Because
Hmm.
if I've got that many in a category, what are the odds I'm going to cycle all the way to the bottom of that list? and,
Right.
and that some entry at the top is going to be. So a great example is I have a glut of area control I mentioned. If I were to buy Dune, I'd have to purge something. And I could list off the top of my head. I give you 5 games: Forbidden Stars, Game of Thrones, Warrior Knights, Cry Havoc, and Command. All very heavy conflict, very different. And I would argue, I could sit here and say, well, yeah, but Game of Thrones does something that Komet doesn't do, and Komet does something that Forbidden Stars doesn't do. And you know what they all do? Sit on my shelf and get dust. So
Right.
Forbidden Stars got the axe for that reason.
I think the exact comparison that I try to do when I have like games is I try to go like, if I were playing this game, yes, I might enjoy it. Like a lot of games, I just enjoy playing. But is there a different game that I would almost always be rather playing? And one that has been kind of like a mainstay in my house that I haven't been able to get rid of yet has been Lords of Waterdeep. Is a great example. A lot of worker placements have come and go, and I have other worker placements on my shelf, including like Dune Imperium, which I think does something very different, though in the same vein as Lords of Waterdeep. I have a heavier worker placement like Caverna on my shelf. Lots of worker placement games. Viticulture is another example. But when something is a little close in the zone, so to speak, of another game, I try to do that simple check for myself. If I was playing this, yes, I'd have a good time. It's not a question of whether or not this is a bad game, but realistically, would I rather be playing this other game? And Lords of Waterdeep has won out so many times. Like if we had like a tier list or, like one of those, like tournament brackets in order to see what all these games are going up against, which would be fun. Like maybe we should do that, John. Have a tournament bracket for the Purge. But Lords of Waterdeep has been like OP every time it's gone up against something. It is top tier, S tier in its contention with everything else.
Well,
Um, Go
that's the thing
ahead.
to think about. Well, when you think about categories too, I try not to limit myself too deeply to just the category. It's also what is the player size, the player count. Do I have games? Obviously, I play games with my wife. I know you do too. So there's two-player is a heavy factor in that. You want to
Right.
have a good selection of two-player games in different genres. Solo games, you're going to want to have, if you've got a limited selection of solo games, you want a variety. You don't want all the same thing. But
Right.
also, 2 to 4 players is a really sweet player count compared to, say, 3 to 6. So the 3 to 6s tend to get the axe much quicker. But I still want to keep maybe one or two around in the collection as a whole for bigger groups of rare occasions. But then also, what is the weight? If I only have 30 minutes to an hour, Lords of Waterdeep is a great example of a very midweight, easy to get to the table, so easy to get to the table. Am I always going to want to play Caverna? No. But while they're both worker placement, I don't feel like they overlap a lot into what they do for me. On the other hand, if I owned Agricola and Caverna, well, that's a huge overlap. one of those is probably going to beat the other one every time. And I think your comparison or your way of describing it is like, would I rather play something else? I imagine it like just spin the wheel and it goes
Mhm.
around and around and it's going to pick a random game. And you ask yourself if it landed on a given game, and I would be like, oh, that's okay, but I'd rather it have gone one space over, oh, just one more to the left. We could be playing Caverna instead of Agricola, right? Because
Well,
that's the
you
best one.
actually texted me about this recently. I was at Costco. I remember being like, "Oh, I could focus on groceries, or instead, I could focus about board games."
John's in a
John and
purge
I could talk about
crisis.
it. You texted me after having played Between Two Castles, Mad King Ludwig for the first time. I brought it over to your house. We played it. We had a great time. You said, "Oh yeah, that was a good game," and then you asked me. The thing is I was thinking about, you have both Suburbia and Between Two Castles, and I feel like those would fit too much of the same itch. What do you think? Like, do you feel like your collection really justifies both? And for me, it does. And I think that's the hardest thing about this topic, but also the best thing about this topic is it's so individual. Like there is no clean answer. There's no the right amount of games for any one person. I think as squishy and subjective as it is, the answer is like, you should get rid of games that don't provide you some sort of joy. And it doesn't even have to be the super pragmatic, I'm going to get it played joy. If the sentimental attachment that you have to a board game like Hero Quest is just right above me, that's a game that I don't think that I'd ever purge. That's a game that I want to have forever, even if I don't, get it to the table, and likely will not get to it in years. I might play it with my kid when he's 10 years old or something, but I still want to have it because of like the sentimental attachment that I have, what it represents to me. Whereas otherwise, I'm very practical and pragmatic when it comes to getting rid of games and not paying too much attention to sentimentality. So like, weigh everything and think about, like, does this provide you sufficient joy that the costs of ownership, the space, the time, the mental attention, the anxiety, all that kind of stuff doesn't outweigh the benefits. And if it does outweigh the benefits, that's when you get rid of it, right?
Yeah, well, and I have one personal thought on that is that, you chose to have a family and started from scratch, and my own experience was a little more abrupt, being a stepfather, and just kind of diving right into it. Honestly, it was a much more abrupt transition for me, and
You
I found that,
bypassed the diaper stage. It was
well,
in some ways the smartest decision you made.
I'm not going to say that part of it was a bad decision at all. But what was interesting to me about it is that there was no conscious decision, and then this act of sort of growing and changing and have my life changing with this decision. It was sort of a, okay, well, if I'm going to do this, all of a sudden I go from being a single man to being a man with a full family. And there wasn't a time where I was also just sort of just married and a young couple either. So it was an abrupt transition for me. And what that meant is, I had a lot of things about my free time and my life that changed. And I don't regret any of that. It was a great decision. I love my wife and I love my kid. And what I give up in that single guy free time is well worth the sacrifice. But when I look at the board games on the shelf, like some of those really heavy hitters that, BSG was one that we really only got it played because we were all about 5 to 10 years younger, had nothing better to do than spend 4 hours playing a board game on a Friday night. You know, that was much easier to do 5 to 10 years ago. And I don't regret the decision to move on with my life, but I also don't need that box sitting on the shelf saying, "Oh, do you remember when you used to be able to do this?" You know,
Right,
to
right, right.
to me, it's better to pass that game on to someone who's going to cherish it and be able to utilize it and just savor the memory of the times I did play it, rather than keep the object and have the object sort of haunt me like a ghost of, weeknights past, so
To
to
get
speak.
Dickensian for us here.
Right.
I know how much we both love our like Victorian novellas. Okay, so we've gotten into like what you're getting rid of, the why, and all this kind of stuff. Before we get into some audience questions here, because we've gotten a couple questions at this point, and I appreciate everyone hopping into chat. Um, eh, how do you do this? Like, this is something that I think is unique for us as Alaskans, in particular Juneau Alaskans, because for those of you who don't know, Juneau, even though it's the capital of Alaska, is inaccessible by roadways. You're only getting out of here by boat, or you're getting out of here by plane, or a very intrepid hike. There is a pretty sizable for the capita board game community here, but it's not exactly easy to, offload a lot of your stuff. Then again, there's also some universals that we have to contend with. I mean, a flat rate shipping box is the same whether it's going from Sacramento, California to San Diego as it is from Juneau, Alaska to New York City. So, some of it translates, some of it might be unique, but what's your experience when you've done your recent purges?
Well, what we're talking about here is how we actually get rid of these games. And first thing I do, of course, I do look at eBay to see, okay, am I holding on to some crazy valuable collector's item?
eBay. Now that's a name I haven't heard in a long time.
Well, I mean, as generous as I like to be with my games, I do want to find them a new home. When it's selling for ridiculous prices because it's a collector's item, it's hard not to say, you know what, this could pay for a few more board games down the road, and also make up for some of the other regrettable decisions I've made. So I kind of have to sell it in good conscience just for that reason. So where it's practical, I do look at eBay where, especially if it's a box that fits in a flat rate shipper, and usually those nice, like 11 by 11 or so, like standard board game boxes ship nicely for like $15. So I'll sell those, but it's got to be worth it. I mean, and if the game isn't selling for, a ridiculous sum, usually I'll either bundle them and try and sell them on a local Facebook group to say, hey, I've got 20 games for, $100 or best offer or whatever, and see if something picks up. I know you had a lot of success, offloading it to a local game club that way, a high school game club, right?
Yeah.
And the last alternative is, we have our local convention, and oftentimes what I do is I just donate in large quantities for the used game table, where they sell it for, honestly, for pennies on the dollar. You could buy a game that might have cost me $50. You can buy it for $5, but it supports the convention. So, and the convention's a worthwhile endeavor, and it still has the benefit of getting into the hands of gamers rather than, say, my greatest fear, and tell me if I'm wrong here, my greatest fear is I'd put it in a yard sale and someone's grandfather would come along and be like, well, little Timmy would love this game. And little Timmy's like 6 and likes Monopoly. And this is like a $50 4-hour board game. And I'm just like, okay, let it go.
Yeah, actually, I have a story about this that isn't related to board games, though, is exactly what you're talking about. Recently, we sold our old table, which we've had for years. My wife and I got it when we were teenagers, before we were even married. And this was intended to play board games. Like, we bought it with the idea of, like, we want a big, nice board game table. And it was the biggest sum of money that I'd ever spent at that time. Like, it was like $1,200 for this beautiful table. It wasn't like a gaming table or anything. It was just a nice dining table, way too big for our apartment. And we even brought it to us when we moved to Juneau, Alaska from up north. And that was an endeavor in and of itself. But finally, we were like, this just doesn't really work for our lives anymore. We got to let go of this table. We've kind of shaped our house around like different things. And we ended up selling it online, and someone came over to look at it, and this beautiful cherry wood table with like some wearing on it, for sure, like there's some wearing. The person was like telling her husband, well, we could always paint it. And my wife was like, put the blinders on, don't worry about it. Like, don't fret the fact that they're trying to paint this gorgeous table, and just, slap a coat of paint on this thing instead of refinishing it or leaving the kind of antiquing as it was, because it wasn't like effed up or anything.
No,
it was just worn off.
Scuffing. I know the table.
Exactly.
There's no call to paint that.
And for a lot of people, they think that antiquing is actually a big part of the character of older furniture and everything. And just like, she was on the verge of tears after the people left, being like, oh my God, I mean, I'm glad the table's out of our life, but did you hear what they said? She was frankly offended.
It just makes me think of that nerd at the store who hears like the mom talking about something, or whatever, and this would be great for so and so, and he's really into this, and just is like horrified. It's like, I can't sell this to you, man.
Yep. Okay. So I think as far as getting rid of games, everything falls into three basic categories. I think, like, if you actually have the games, which what you mentioned earlier was really important. The first part of being better at, conservation is not recycling. It's not reusing, it's the reducing. First and foremost, do you need to put things into your collection? But if you do have them in your collection, um you know and you need to get rid of them, then it's going to fall into either you give it away, you trade it, or you're going to sell it. You already covered eBay. If you're looking for methods of getting rid of games, I mean, there's subreddits that are dedicated to selling games. I like using that as a method because, you can kind of develop like internal cred from our board game exchange. And that way you become a verified seller or verified purchaser, and people kind of have this internal community. There's more free discussion to be had about it. If something is messed up, I feel like circumventing the formal route of like eBay or something is it allows you to kind of have a conversation with someone about things. So I like Board Game Exchange. Board Game Geek has a lot of seller features, and that's fantastic. And you mentioned Facebook earlier, or other social media sites. But I think you and I, for ages, time immemorial, have practiced giving games, like, to our friends, to one another, like almost always for years at this point. Whenever we go to get rid of games, we just send each other a list of like, hey, do you want any of these? Before I get rid of them, do you want these? Just to make sure that, someone else is going to appreciate these games, because, like, one, I don't want them to end up in the trash because of that conservation thing. That's a nightmare. The amount of carbon footprint that went into making this thing, but also it's a game that I loved enough to have in my collection at one point. I don't want that to go to recycling if I can avoid it. So I'd rather go to my friends who, whether they can afford games or not, whether it's an issue of, they just haven't had a chance to play the game, or they didn't have the game because I had the game and they were like, well, I don't need it to add it to my collection, but they would be sad if they miss the opportunity to pick it up for free. So, I'm not saying you have to be benevolent with your collection, but first see if anyone in your game group or your library or your local convention, a school could use any of these games. A lot of teachers run board game clubs at this point, Dungeons and Dragons clubs. Like, gladly take all of your old D&D books if you wanted to get rid of them. And then trading. Like, there's math trades that happen online, which is a really cool system. Like, I don't
Those
know,
are a lot
John.
of fun.
Yeah.
I got to do a live one at Shucks 2018, and those are just a lot of fun. It's just like, it's that classic, like, well, I'm going to start with a paperclip and I'm going to end up with a house kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
You may never actually get a house, but it's cool to see that, like, I've got this completely unrelated fluff game that to me I don't want, and I end up with something I really, actually desired and wasn't, able to find.
Yeah, I always think of Zelda Link's Awakening whenever I'm doing a math trade, because it's just like everyone is getting what they're asking for. And ultimately, it really helps me out because I got the game I wanted here. You have to kind of have trust in the system. Like, that was the biggest hurdle for me, was like, does this work? I just like tell an algorithm that I want X, Y, and Z game, and it just kind of matches things up. But yeah, people do it all the time. Board Game Geek is probably the biggest facilitator of this, but like, internally within all kinds of forums, shut up and sit downs forums, they do that. I wouldn't be surprised if here in Juneau, Platypus Con might make like a big trade event or table, either officially or unofficially, a feature in the future.
Yeah,
feature and future. That's hard to say.
A future. You have to get to that critical mass, though, of people interested in trading, so that it kind of greases the wheels of, like, that paperclip has to go to the guy who wants the shell, who wants, to trade it for the tire swing, who gets the house or something. So
Totally. Well,
It's a big jump to house from there.
Totally. Well, before we let everyone go here, before we let each other go, because inevitably we're going to want to have dinner here in Alaska. I don't know where everyone else is in the world. I was talking to someone who was in the United Arab Emirates on my most recent live stream where I was doing like some solo stuff that blew my mind. But here in Alaska, it's creeping up on 6 o'clock here pretty soon. But let's answer some questions. If anyone has any audience questions here about getting rid of games or otherwise, look, Mike Travis just joined.
I know. He doesn't have a question.
Great.
He has a statement about Ball John. And yeah, when he last saw me, I had a lot more hair. And I have long since given up the pretense of having any hair from about this part of my head up. So.
Yeah, shout out to Mike Travis, one of our gaming buddies who moved down south to the lower 48, as we call the rest of the continental or contiguous U.S. Okay, so we had a question here earlier. Don Clemson, who's in chat right now, but also asked us on Discord, was asking, have you ever regretted getting rid of a game after a purge? And it just so happened that that exact same question came up by Musar523. So you ever had any regrets? You ever gotten rid of something and kind of went, maybe I made a horrible mistake there?
I'll try not to be too long-winded, but this is my second personal experience I wanted to share. I was really looking forward to sharing is that in 2017, I had an apartment fire. I was uninsured at the time. The year before, I moved in with my wife, and we stood a very good chance of losing everything. And we lost actually about 3 full rooms in that house worth of stuff. We walked away with mostly the kitchen, the living room, couch, and TV, and then, oddly enough, the board game room that we had at the time. And we were fortunate enough we somehow stumbled into this ridiculously large apartment for a somewhat reasonable price. So we had a separate room for board games, and my entire board game collection that I brought into this relationship was in that room. And our bedrooms went up, the spare room went up, and everything in there was lost. And the fire crept down the hall. And the only reason that the fire department was able to put it out before the board game room went up is because I had my door closed. So little public service announcement there. Close your doors in your house when you're not in it, because it actually does act as a fire break and help save rooms of your house from destruction should it catch on fire when you're not there. But that experience, I did lose a few games that were on the floor at the time because the spray from the fire hoses did soak the floors in other rooms, and it got into the carpet in the other room. But after cleaning them all up and getting all the smoke damage and stuff off everything, 99.9% of the collection was okay. But losing those 10 games or so that were on the ground and losing all that other stuff, and a lot of actual personal things were in the spare room, very much makes it easy to say, you know what? It's just stuff.
Yeah.
Let go. When the stuff has been taken from you forcibly, it kind of forces you to reconcile it. And either it's traumatic and you hang onto your stuff tighter, or in my case, you look at it and go, yeah, I guess it really is just stuff, huh? I mean, as long as you've got the essentials, which we did. We had friends and family we could stay with. We recovered financially after another year or so. And kind of put things back together. So, like, as far as the board games go, I was lucky to keep them, but now letting them go, it's hard to really regret that stuff. So, a little longer of an answer, but I kind of thought that was a really relevant experience I had for that.
Okay, well, I have an actual answer, John. Okay. I don't need to go all Mr. Rogers on everyone.
Fire That's what I do to purge. I just light the whole house on fire.
No, I actually think that's really great. I mean, it's important to have perspective. And like you said, having a significant event like that makes you kind of reconcile, like what are the priorities that I have in my life and what am I okay with letting go of? Like sometimes people think so much about the possessions that they have that kind of like dominates their mental space that could be occupied by, much more meaningful things. To get all high school edgelord on you, it's like they say in Fight Club, the things you own end up owning you. But Mage Knight. I've owned Mage Knight now 3 times. I got it. I think I got it as like a Christmas present or something. And then I played it, and this was early on in my gaming, and I was like,
this is early.
this is too much. And I got rid of it. And then I was like, maybe I just wasn't as experienced of a gamer. Maybe it really is the best game in the world. And then I got it again. And I paid US dollars in order to get that sucker again. And then I was like, um, yeah, I played tons of heavy games at this point. I love a ton of heavy games. I just don't really want to invest the time into this. I realize why people like it. Don't want to invest the time in it. Got rid of it again. And now I ended up inheriting a copy, which I've been playing a lot of solo games, in particular the last 2 years. And I know this is like the cream of the crop when it comes to solo games for a lot of people. A lot of people think of this as like the bar for solo solitaire gaming. And there's part of me that's like, oh, should I give it another try? Has my perspective changed again? And I haven't gotten rid of it yet, but it is in the like holding pile,
danger zone,
the danger zone, the vicinity of destruction.
In my spreadsheet, they're the ones I highlight orange.
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
The orange zone. Like, they're not red, they're not purges, but they're edged in there.
They're on deck. But I still want to try it again. But I have a feeling that even if I get it to the table before the right way of purging it comes along, it's going to just make a big wet bleh. And I'm going to get rid of it again. But maybe not. Maybe I'll love it. Maybe I'll love it. Vlada Chvátil is... Vlada Chvátil makes some amazing games and also some games that I just have never been really that into. Don't at me, Dungeon Lords fans. So one more question I got from Davey Munez on Twitter, who asked, when purging a game or deciding whether or not to keep one game from among two, do you weight heavier a game that has more flexibility or more intrinsic joy to you? Like, essentially, is it a better game for your collection or is it a better game for you? And if you had to get rid of one, what are you going to get rid of?
Ooh, heavy hitting there, because that actually bites deep for me. I am a different kind of gamer than many of the people in my circle. I love almost every game I've played. I find something to love about it, but I also do lean towards some of those heavy hitting games and some of those really high conflict, just because of what I grew up on between Magic and Risk and that sort of background. So when I look at what I want, well, those are going to be really brain burning, heavy fight games, or some mixture thereof, right? But when I look at what am I going to get played, and what are the people that I play with, what are they going to enjoy? I honestly lately have been weighting that a little heavier, because at the end of the day, the game that I love that sits on the shelf is still less valuable to me than the game that I still really, really enjoy, but gets off the shelf and plays with those people. And especially if those other people showing a little bit of empathy, I know it's unusual for me, but if I can feed a little bit off of their excitement, if I can play a game I know they're going to love and actually ask me to play, that kind of puts a little bit of weight over my own desires.
Yeah, I agree. And it's all spectrums, right? You know, like if a game is like so much exactly what I love about games, but I know I'm only ever going to play it once a year, um, then that is a strong contender for a keeper for me. A great example of this is Eclipse Second Dawn. I know that is not the jam, jelly, or peanut butter of most of the people that I play games with, but I know that if I want to make it happen, I can make that happen once a year, or maybe a couple times a year if I really drove for that to happen, especially as my kid gets older and I have more flexibility. But I enjoy playing games, and so the likelihood of a game getting played by way of it being a more flexible game is probably going to be, way heavier to me, though solitaire gaming has really kind of opened that up. That decision matrix is now all of a sudden all over the place, because if I can have a lot of fun playing it just by myself and take the whole other human equation out of it, then
that opens it wide up, right?
Exactly.
I'll throw out my specific example as Mage Wars. Falls on the other side of the fence. Is I really love what Mage Wars does. I love the conflict. I love all the choices and the possibilities. It brings back that love of Magic, but it's much more self-contained. You don't have to keep buying it once you have a certain amount. But the thing is, it takes a certain amount of, you have to learn the game. You have to know the game. You have to know those cards. I'm not going to find someone else who's going to dedicate that much time and energy into learning a game that I love, unless I maybe lived in a bigger city and found a Mage Wars community or something. But even then, I'm not going to dedicate enough to be part of a community. I just want one other person who plays it as much as I do, or would like to. So the reality is if I want something head-to-head in that family of games, I'm going to pick something lighter up, even call out maybe like Summoner Wars 2nd Edition. I would pick that game better, even though it doesn't, to me, scratch the itch quite as well as Mage Wars. I know that it's going to get played, and I know other people will ask for it more in my circle of friends.
Totally.
So it's a sacrifice I'll make to drop down a tier for me if it brings it up a tier for my group.
Well, we'll end this with one more question here. Mike Travis, our buddy Mike Travis, the lower 48er Mike Travis asks, what steps do you take proactively to avoid needing to purge as much? And I think these are very different answers for each of us. Personally, because the greatest bulk of game intake for me is review copies. I don't want to beat around the bush or obfuscate the fact that I get free games as a reviewer. And part of that is being able to say no to projects. Like, there are hot games that come out that I think would get views and get the clicks if I had a review of it, but I try to actually review things that I think I would have something interesting to say about and hopefully enjoy. If there's not a chance that I look at that sheet of paper and go like, this just sounds like so not my thing, or it just sounds horrible, it doesn't feel good to review that. And also, I don't really want to waste my time playing that. I don't love every game that I anticipate loving, and I don't only say yes to games that I know for a fact that I'll love, but I do try to be somewhat selective about the games that I bring into my house, which I think is important for anyone, whether they're a reviewer or not, is to actually do a little bit of research and imagine yourself playing this and, apply the same standards that you would have for the games that you want to hit your table, the games that you're going to purge, that kind of stuff, to your life when it comes to, just getting new games. The acquisition, you need to think about, is this another potential purge in the waiting? Ultimately, I'm going to get games because I do want to continue this channel. I do want it to thrive. And sometimes I'll also take on games that I don't have as formed of a I guess not opinion. I try to not have an opinion going into a game, but an anticipation of my enjoyment of the game. If I think that like this is a smaller publisher and I want to help them out, or there's tons of factors that go into me saying yes to a project, because I'm not like just A-list. I'm not PewDiePie here. They're not just sending me all the games. It's not a truck comes up to my house and I get 15 games a week. I still have to, oftentimes ask for copies, or when I get asked, I have to work it into my schedule and think about, do I have the time to dedicate to this? And what about this game versus this other game? So I try to be thoughtful about taking games in. But what about you, John? Like, what's your approach for that reduce of the RRR cycle?
Well, as one of those plebs who still has to pay for games, I have to think about the economic factor. So
Totally.
there's that. But no, the thing is if I set the money aside, okay, the assumption is that we're all being good with our money, and I'm budgeting things, and so any purchase I make is within my budget of X amount of dollars per month, a year, week, whatever it is, right? Mm-hmm. So if I'm setting aside the money factor, I'm thinking about, one, is it a sure hit? Do I know I love it? Have I played it already? And I do have, through the convention, through the ability to borrow games from our convention library year round, I do have the opportunity, and through playing games with you, frequently I'm playing a lot of the newer games. If I really want to try something, I can. So that's almost always I've played it once. I don't buy games blindly anymore. And I would encourage anybody who has a sizable collection to really adopt that as a good consumer practice. Go into it knowing you're going to like it before you buy it, because really it's not doing anybody a favor if you end up having to purge it later, including yourself
Right.
and the environment, right? But also, I try to think about what game, I think proactively about what game it would replace if I were to get it. And that was exactly why I called you up, or I texted you rather. I don't call people. I texted you about
Between Two Castles and Suburbia.
Between Two Castles. Yeah, because I don't know about you, but I'm guilty of being excited about every game the first time I play it. Even if it has to be really like C- experience for me to get excited. New games
totally.
excite me. So I never impulse buy. I always temper that excitement. I always wait at least a good week or two before I even start thinking about, do I want to own this? And then I look at my collection and I ask the serious question, what would it replace? And when I looked at my collection and I saw Suburbia, and I'm like, well, you've got that drafting selection element. You're building a sort of a tableau or an environment there with adjacency as a big feature. It's going to have a lot of those same elements. What would Castles do that Suburbia doesn't? Is there room for both, or do they replace each other?
Mm-hmm.
Ultimately, I actually may end up getting that one because it's unique in its collaborative aspect, that there really might be. And that your input was very valuable on that, because but then I have to think, well, okay, if it doesn't replace Suburbia, what does it replace?
Exactly.
And that's a tough question to answer. But if you don't think of it now, you'll be thinking of it later when you're actually having to let go of something kind of by force.
Also, I think not haunting Kickstarter. I mean, Kickstarter preys on people having that FOMO, the fear of missing out.
The hype cycle, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And, like the Kickstarter creators know exactly what they're doing. And I'm not saying that it's anything sinister, but they want you to feel like you will never have access to that game again. And if you find yourself in that position where you're vulnerable, you are kickstarting everything, then take a step back, like recognize it as like that's a poor impulse control on your part. Some people are totally fine. But this is true on anything in life. I have poor impulse control, especially when it comes to certain things, like that initial enjoyment of games, acquiring games. Food is bad impulse control for me. And Kickstarter can absolutely prey into that for me, and has in the past. But I do try to think about like even recent things, I don't get all review copies. I have to buy some games. I try to think about like the Kickstarters that I've gotten, and I backed it with such huge excitement a year and a half ago, and the game finally arrives. And even before I open it, that whole hype zone that I was in has just dissipated, and I'm kind of ambivalent about the game. And it's like, oh, this is cool. But I've kind of moved on because it wasn't necessarily the game that was driving that. It was like the hype train,
the hype cycle
surrounding
it. Exactly that.
And then you're kind of like, oh, if you are lucky, then the game will actually execute on what you wanted it to do, and you'll have that revitalizing feeling of the game is great and you get to play it and all those things. Eclipse Second Dawn would be a good example of this, of a game that, like, even if you waited ages, you get it to the table and you're like, this is everything that I wanted it to be. But there are also games where it's like, wow, I mean, the idea of this game was great, and being part of that community and being so excited about this was great. But now that it's here, it's kind of just a meh experience. Think about that next time that you're thinking that you need to back 5 games in a month. Just, keep that in the back of your mind. So that's my proactive advice for that, Mike.
I have one bonus tip for you on the heels of that. It's a short and sweet one. It's that if you're a nerd who has, and that's someone who, and that's really just
if
passion.
We're making some suppositions about you, me, and everyone on this chat here. If you happen to be a nerd,
Then I don't know how you stumbled in here. This is but a nerd is someone who's passionate about an interest, right? That's the idea. And so if you're a nerd who has a lot of interests outside of board gaming, a lot of other media, video games, books, TV, movies, then licensed IPs are a honeypot for you. They are a trap. I cannot tell you how many times I've heard either my own personal experience or someone else who has bought into a licensed IP thinking this is it. They finally made a game for this awesome thing that I'm super passionate about and I identify with. and I've got to get it, especially Kickstarter. They love those. And they just
Mega
abused
Man.
oh my God. Mega Man was a terrible idea. It was a terrible idea for me. Dark Souls was not a good decision. And that Dark Souls was probably the last one that I jumped in on where I was just like, I'm really hot for this IP. I'm going to buy this game sight unseen. Nope. Should have waited.
Yep.
So
Yep.
that's my one tip is if you need to go above and beyond to avoid those Kickstarters or those pre-order campaigns, even if you're a fan of Dune, maybe wait and see what the release says on or what the reviewers are saying about the new Dune game, because I know my
The
impulse is to pick
reviewers.
it up right away. Yeah, I'm gonna make Jack get a copy before I buy mine, is what I'm saying.
Oh man. Okay. Well, this has been great to talk to you, John, and I appreciate everyone in chat. The idea for Off the Table is we're hoping to do this on a weekly basis around the same time on Mondays. If you have an idea for a focused topic, whether it's a particular news item, it's an event going on in board games, or it's another discussion topic like this, we would love to hear it. If you got questions about anything to do with board games or even not to do with board games. I mean, we could talk to you about archery. We could talk to you about the kayaks that we never built. We could talk to you.
Talk about collecting hobbies.
Yeah, we could talk to you about any number of things, whether we're subject matter experts or not, because we like to talk. We'd love to hear it. A great place to do that is in the comment sections on our videos, on Twitter, and then we're really trying to focus on Discord recently. There's a lot of great discussion going on there. But bottom line, thank you for watching the Cardboard Herald. Oh, and we're also going to make audio versions of this go up the next day on the podcast channel. So you'll also have that audio mixed in with the interviews and all the other stuff that we're doing that we put up on the podcast. So I appreciate everyone for joining in for one of our earlier live streams, and looking forward to talking to you next time, John.
All right. See you next time.
All right. I clicked end stream.